It's a well-known fact that advancing your skills needs to be based on a foundation of solid basics. And so I want to talk today about operant conditioning. So before we get into the quadrants of operant conditioning, there are a couple terms that we need to understand. The first is reinforce, and that means increasing a particular behavior, whether we're looking at the rate increasing or the probability of that behavior occurring again in the future. Punishment refers to decreasing the rate or probability of a particular behavior. Positive, negative, that refers to adding or removing something. Think of it like plus or minus, not good or bad. But when we're talking about that, we're talking about adding something good or bad. And there are specific terms we use to describe that. First is appetitive. Appetitive is something that the learner wants to work to access. It's something that they want to get closer to, they want to have. The second is aversive. Aversive is something that the learner will work to avoid, stop, or escape. So I often see aversive conflated with this idea of some observable level of discomfort or pain or fear. If the learner is working to avoid it, it's sufficiently aversive. So now when we're talking about the 4 quadrants, they describe the relationship of how behavior is changing as a result of adding or subtracting something appetitive or aversive. So the first is positive reinforcement. That means that we're adding something appetitive to increase the chances of a behavior happening again in the future. An example of this would be giving a treat. Negative reinforcement is removing something aversive to increase the chances that a behavior will occur again in the future. So for example, the seatbelt alarm in your car. You get in, it starts beeping at you. When you buckle your seatbelt, it stops. The removal of the beeping is the aversive, and that reinforces the likelihood that you're going to buckle your seatbelt in the future because you want to avoid that beeping alarm. It's not that the beeping alarm is scaring you, but it is something that you're working to avoid. You don't want access to it. Positive punishment is the addition of something aversive to decrease the rate or probability of a behavior occurring again in the future. So an example of this is leash pressure. If the animal works to avoid that after it's added, then it is probably positive punishment. Negative punishment is removing something appetitive to decrease a particular behavior in the future. So an example of this would be timeout, removing privileges. When we're looking at those 4 quadrants, they describe a relationship between the behavior and what follows the behavior and how that behavior is changing. So the easiest way to illustrate this and kind of confirm whether or not an operant relationship is at play, because sometimes it's not, sometimes it's things beyond operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a small part of learning. It's not everything. So we look at a basic 3-term contingency. This is our ABCs of behavior. And the easiest way to do that is what we call an ABC analysis. A refers to antecedent. This is what happens right before a behavior. B is the behavior. And C is the consequence, or what happens immediately after a behavior. We want to list those things out. And that helps us to assess what kind of relationship there could or could not be at play and whether or not further investigation is needed. So let's look at some examples. Let's say we say sit, the dog sits, then the dog is given a treat. If the dog sitting behavior has increased, it's getting more reliable, it's happening at a higher rate, then being given a treat means we're adding a treat. So that is positive reinforcement. The relationship between the behavior and the consequence is positive reinforcement. Another example is we say sit, the dog sits, and then we praise. We say something like, good boy. Now, if that behavior doesn't change, it's not increasing, it's not decreasing, then the praise, even if it's intended to be a reward, it's intended to be positive reinforcement, if it's not increasing the behavior, then it's nothing, it's neutral. There's no operant relationship here. And we probably want to replace that with something that's going to have more of an effect on that behavior. Now let's say we say sit and the dog sits and then the dog is pet on the head. The dog's behavior starts off pretty good and then it suddenly takes a dip. The dog stops responding to the cue as frequently or as reliably, and that gives us information. So the decrease in behavior means that this sitting behavior is being punished. Even if we're not intending to, we're not adding anything that we're intentionally punishing with. Because we're adding something, we're adding petting, then by definition this becomes positive punishment. And that lets us know that the petting for that learner is aversive, because if the sitting leads to being pet and they're trying to avoid that sequence, then they're trying to avoid that consequence. So that tells us that petting on the head for that learner is aversive. And we need to find another consequence if we're trying to increase that behavior. Now, I often see people explaining things away despite their operations. So saying something like pulling on the leash is redirecting the animal, it's not punishing the animal. But it doesn't really matter what narrative we apply. If it's operating in a particular way, that defines what's happening. It's not about how we feel about it. And so, for example, let's say that the dog sees a squirrel and they start to speed up, and that causes them to move ahead and away from whoever's holding the leash. And so in response to that, the handler pulls back suddenly on the leash. If the dog speeding up in response to those distractions decreases, let's say evidence of that is that they start maintaining a behavior like a heel, then the adding of leash pressure punished that behavior, which makes it positive punishment. Another operation that could be at play, if we're seeing that heel behavior then increase, which is taking the place of the undesirable behavior, then that behavior is being reinforced in some way too. And so let's say the dog feels the pressure of the leash and that prompts them to slow down, to move away from that pressure, to escape pressure. And so by slowing down, they sort of return to that informal heel position, and then that pressure is removed. So because that behavior is increasing and something was removed that the animal is avoiding based on the decrease of the other behavior, we know that element of what was added, that leash pressure, could be aversive. And so negative reinforcement could be at play. Sometimes there's no relationship that is operant. There's something else going on that we need to investigate. An example of this, let's say a dog sees another dog and they bark. They start barking while they're out on their walk. The dog's across the street and they're at the end of the leash making all this noise. And then the dog is given a treat. And over time, the barking lessens, it disappears, it starts to diminish. If we're adding a treat and the behavior decreases, is it positive punishment? Well, no, because the dog is taking those treats, it's working for those treats, so that's not an aversive, that's an appetitive. The dog isn't avoiding that stimulus, they aren't escaping it or trying to stop it. And that's not to say that there aren't circumstances in which that may be happening, like a dog that isn't feeling well that day. But we want to look at the trend over time, what's happening in that situation. And so the adding of an appetitive and the decrease of behavior just isn't one of those quadrants. So there isn't an operant relationship happening. But if the behavior is decreasing and there's no operant relationship, then we have to ask ourselves why that is. What is happening in that situation? And it could be the result of another system of learning like classical conditioning, or any number of factors related to the relationship between some of those terms or even more terms. What's the function? What are the motivating operations? How is that changing? So this is why it's really important to know the basics. And so we'll continue this series. If you have questions, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, tune in for the next part.